welcoming Cindy Kent as the first guest of Learning from Leaders. This is the first. This is the reboot of a series of meetings, all focused on continuing growth and continuing education. Cindy, first of all, although this is not the most impressive of the accomplishments, but you should all know she is a board member at Accolade. One of the things we've been very focused on from a board perspective, as well as from a company perspective, is ensuring that we've got a diverse set of perspectives in that boardroom. And over the last year, we've been able to bring on incredible board members like Pat Waters, who's the CHRO at Procore, or Dawn Lepore, who used to run drugstore.com, and now Cindy Kent, who joins us after a remarkable career in healthcare, but most recently as the executive vice president and the president of senior living at Brookdale Senior Living, the largest senior living company in the United States. Prior to that, Cindy's been pretty busy in her career. She was the president of 3M's infection prevention division, which is almost a $2 billion global business with operations around the world. And before that, was an executive at Medtronic, a company that many of us at Accolade know really well. She has an undergraduate degree from Northwestern and a dual master's degree in marketing and divinity from Vanderbilt. And so today, Cindy's based in Nashville, Tennessee. Cindy, first of all, I don't know how we do Zoom clapping, but I just want you to know we're all thrilled that you're here. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. I am so grateful to be here. And the funniest thing is my first board meeting is later this week. So I am delighted that I get to meet the employees ahead of my board meeting. So thank you for having me.
That's totally true. I didn't even piece that together. You're exactly right. In this strange world that we're living in, Cindy and I have never met in person, but I'm hoping that that's going to change here soon. So Cindy, we've solicited questions from our employees. I've got some questions of my own that I want to start us off with. But how about if we just jump right in? And if you wouldn't mind telling us a little bit of your story. I've had a chance to learn your story about where you grew up and the type of family you grew up in. But we'd love to hear you maybe tell your story a little bit, and then if you could, you grew up maybe linking that story of growing up in a working class family to making a decision to be a woman who got into the STEM field. And then not only that, to go to a world-class institution like Northwestern that's pretty far away from home. Tell us the origin of Cindy Kent.
Wow, that is a big question in a short time. But most simply, as Ross said, I grew up in Nashville, Tennessee. And the fascinating thing that I'm here 30 years later, I have never adulted in Tennessee before coming back 2 months before we entered into the pandemic. And to be in a business like senior living that was so devastated and impacted by the coronavirus. And I can't make that stuff up on my best day. So how it all, fits together is, as Ross said, I was born and raised, my parents had me very young. And so they were teens, and I was an only child. And honestly, growing up with modest means to a blue collar family, I was always told that education would be my way out. That was just my family's thing. Every summer, I was always in some after school program or some summer program, but always learning. So that my parents definitely created a path that was new and unfamiliar for themselves, but like most of our parents, wanting something better for us. And so I, was encouraged to try out all of the things that I was interested in. So dabbled in sports and tried out instruments and did band work. But probably the most pivotal and crucial moment of college and STEM came when I was in high school. My junior year, we were going through the battery of standardized tests for college admissions. And I thought my own little plan in my feeble mind at the time was that I was going to do theater and psychology. I wanted to be a therapist. And so maybe that's why I worked out the divinity thing later. I don't know. But that's what I thought I was going to do. And I remember my high school guidance counselor. I don't even know if they have those anymore. So that's a while back. But the high school guidance counselor calling my mother, because if you get her on board, all bets were off, and saying, "You've got this little brown girl growing up in the South who happens to be good at math and science. There is no way she cannot be an engineer." And it pivoted the entire conversation. And so, I was pretty vocal even then and was advocating for my collegiate rights. And so what it boiled down to is my mother says, you get a choice, but you get to choose what kind of engineer you want to be. You don't get to choose if you want to be an engineer. And so, and that was the journey. And so I spent that following summer between junior and senior year at Georgia Tech in a 3-week summer program. And it was so hard because everything that they introduced us to, like we spent a lot of time in Chemie, we spent a lot of time in EE, and none of those things kind of resonated with me. Chemie a little bit, but not as much. And we were in the student union, and I heard a student who had just come back to campus, for a weekend, wasn't even there from her internship, was talking about these time and motion studies. And whatever it was, hooked me. And I was like, what kind of engineer are you? And she said, industrial engineering. That was the day. Then it was about finding schools that had industrial engineering. And so we used to have this little rubric in college to apply to a competitive school, a safe school, state school. That was the rubric. And so I applied to Georgia Tech, industrial, Northwestern because they had industrial. A lot of programs didn't. And then Vanderbilt was what I thought was the state school, was my state school, but they didn't have industrial engineering. So I applied and got in there in Chemie. And so I remember, after the early admissions, I did them all early. And my guidance counselor saying, Cindy, that kind of wasn't the rubric we were talking about. Those aren't safe schools. So the great news is I found out early and got in and ultimately chose Northwestern. But much like the pandemic that we just described, and I stayed industrial the whole time, never wavered, but I was granted a waiver on my electives. So literally all of my electives were in the School of Theater at Northwestern, and I was 1 year short of getting dual bachelors, but the idea of staying in college another year just didn't interest me. So I just have found that I had the best of all of the worlds because how well that training in theater or on the stage just really, I think, increased the opportunity of the platform skills that we use and need so much now, and connecting with the audience or connecting with folks. I find that, the higher I went, all of the training that we get in media training and platform skills and executive presence really goes back to some of those lessons I learned in those theater courses way back when.
That story is so awesome. Coming from a kid who, my parents were in arranged marriage, married at 15 and 14, had their first, my older brother when they're 18 and 17. And also I got a very similar speech from an Indian dad who just said, well, you can be a doctor or an engineer, so your choice, but those are your choices.
Right.
And that's, I think Ashantanu Nundi's on here. Ashantanu can attest. Like, I think I made the choice I had to make. Engineering school seemed like a better choice for me. But I remember engineering school, Cindy, and I think this is reflective of a question about your journey. My bet is if your engineering school was anything like the engineering classes I was in, you were one of the only women in those classes. And especially by the time you got to the third, fourth year of school, you were one of the only women in the class, and there weren't a lot of people who looked like you in that class. Tell me about, if you could, what that was like. But I'm just curious as to how that experience played a role in how you approached your work professionally beyond that.
Oh, first of all, I love the question, and I put in homework on that one and engaged some of my classmates on this one. And so what I found, there were about 300 students in my graduating engineering class, undergrad, bachelor's at Northwestern in '91. And honestly, I didn't feel the real presence. Women were almost a third of the class, actually. And so I didn't feel a real gap as it related to gender. Where I felt a real gap in my engineering experience were students of color. There just wasn't. I was a strange industrial engineer in that I loved thermodynamics, I loved differential equations, and so even though those weren't required, when I went to those classes, it was more of a rarity to be a female in the class, but even a greater rarity to be an African American in the class. I think there were 12 of us. And all of us were involved in NSBE, the National Society of Black Engineers. We studied together. We, probably more than half of us were in the student gospel choir. So that was highly socialized. But obviously, learning how to connect and relate to others and all kinds of people, even though this was my support base, was critically important, especially now, my high school was extremely diverse, but my schools coming up, primary schools before that, were predominantly African American. So this was such an overwhelming and such a big experience at Northwestern, but one that I think really set me up in life of learning to relate and engage and be engaged by all sorts of people. Now, here's the fascinating thing. 8 of the 12 of us that graduated together are still hanging together, and we call ourselves the crew. So I sent an email out when I saw your questions to the crew to say, hey, how many did we graduate with? And I kid you not, we've got, and they are phenomenal, like names that you would recognize that you see in the news. We graduated together. So it really is just such a positive and lifelong relationship. And it took the general counsel for one of the insurance companies that was in our class that found the online publication of our entire graduation program. And I kid you not, we all competed to see who could count the fastest to come up with the number in our graduating class. And so then we argued that you can't count the master's people and the PhD people. So that's how we came up with our 288 about that graduated bachelor. So yeah, we still hang tight, and we still bounce, when we are going through challenges and navigating decisions. One of our closest friends, for example, just made the S team at Amazon, Alicia Bowler Davis, who was at General Motors before then. And so we're coordinating. We're all going to probably come to Seattle, by the way. She's in Seattle now, to visit her. She's hosting us there. But, when we make moves between companies and that kind of thing, generally we find our way to each other for still mentoring, support, and advice.
Yeah, so we have to dig on that point. The idea of that. Was it, you didn't say squad, you said the crew. Is it the crew?
We're the crew.
The crew sticking together and continuing to root for each other and take care of each other and mentor each other as peers is a super interesting story that we have to dig on. Before we do, I'm going to skip past Vanderbilt and go to your first job at Eli Lilly. You jump in, and at Accolade, I'd say that there's a huge component of our people who are in their first or second jobs out of school, and so a lot of people who are going to be watching this presentation are seeking advice as to, you're oftentimes, if you were like me, I was 22 working at Ford Motor Company. I was pretty confused as to how I was supposed to. I knew where I was, but I had no idea how I was supposed to get where all these people running the company were. I didn't know exactly what the path was to get to that spot. You got some advice from someone who took an interest in your career and said, "Hey, look around." And I'm just curious, one, how you process that feedback, meaning experience more roles and really broaden your skill set or your view on the business, and maybe if I were to reverse that and say, hey, what would you tell somebody between the ages of 20 and 30 just getting them started in business? Like, what would the big piece of advice you give them be?
Yeah, I would. There are 2 pieces from that period of my life that have become lifelong lessons, and they were both from executives at Eli Lilly from my first 4 years there. The very first one, and the person that Raj is referring to, who's now passed away, who has given me still the gift that keeps on giving. His name was Paul Johnson. He died of cancer several years ago, and he was the senior vice president of operations. And I was in engineering, so I wasn't even in his business line or reporting line. But he happened to be the executive sponsor. And again, I'm dating myself, but this is when we were first using and created the first diversity committees in corporate. Like that never existed before 1991 and 1990s. And so Paul was the executive sponsor of Eli Lilly's first diversity committee. And my eager and enthusiasm, I volunteered. Sign me up. I want to be a trainer. Anything that I needed to do, I volunteered. So making the best out of these employee resource groups to work with folks that aren't necessarily in your department, in your line, just gave me so much more exposure across the company because I met people that I wouldn't ordinarily meet. And it was in that passion and enthusiasm outside of my day job that one day, about 3 months into it, Paul asked me, so what do you want to do with your career? Now I think about that and I'd be horrified because my answer, as I was 21, I don't know. I'm just grateful to have a job and pay my rent kind of on time sometimes. And so, and to be off my parents' payroll. And I had no idea. I mean, that was such a large question. And furthermore, my engineering executives had a mandate that I couldn't leave my department. And so because of Paul's advocacy that I now have words for, you know what he was? He was my first sponsor. The sponsor is the person who takes an active interest in you to leverage their social, political capital for you. And so he advocated to get me out of engineering 2.5 years early. He paid out of his budget for me to have about $12,000, a series of batteries of tests to assess my cognitive skills and my interest and capabilities to make sure that I was worth the investment, right? That whole taking a risk on her. I scored pretty highly. And 6 months later, I found myself in Detroit, Michigan, doing a sales assignment. And so he basically advocated to go experience as many different things as you can and get to know the company and the business from all these different angles. So that would be my advice too, just that spirit of a learning, a constant learner and continual learner. So I love how you opened up this session of this culture at Accolade of continuous learning, because that's exactly the gift that Paul sponsored me on. The second was right before I got ready to go to graduate school. I knew that I was going to go to graduate school. I had no expectation. I was prepared to leave the company to go full time. And I got called by the CHRO, which is crazy, as associate. I mean, seriously, and I got called to the 12th floor at the corporate headquarters. Now, remember, I started my career at a remote plant site in central Indiana in a cornfield. I'm not making that up. And so to get called to corporate, to go to the 12th floor for the head of HR a few months before I was leaving for grad school, and his name was Pedro Granadillo. And he said, I hear that you're going to graduate school. I said, yes. And then the most embarrassing thing, I bumbled over, why are you doing divinity and business, and kind of stumbled over that a little bit and answered his questions. And I remember he had this wood panel that looked something like Raj's backdrop office there, this dark wood, beautiful paneling, and said, what? And he was staring out the window and looking very professorial. And he said, what if I told you that the company wanted to sponsor you in your graduate degree? And I said, what does that mean, right? And then, no. My first question was, why would you want to do that? Why would you want to do that? So I'm so grateful for that saying and adage of God bless babies and fools, because I was a little bit of both at that point. But this is my second piece of advice. I told that long, winding story to get to my advice for all of you that are early in your career, and that's lead from where you are. Because unbeknownst to me, that at now 26, now at 26, that the company and its leaders had been amassing a series of data points And at this point, I was in my 4th job. So when Paul unleashed me from engineering, I did sales, I did human resources, and I did marketing. And so now I'm coming out of marketing, find the love of my life, and am about to go to graduate school. And the advice that I would give you that he gave to me was lead from where you are, because they were paying attention. They were like, Cindy, you're not even a manager. You're still an associate. Maybe I made it up one rung on the ladder. And he says, and yet you have such enormous followership. People listen to you. You're credible. And those are transferable skills that we can't hire for. We can go get the most analytical MBAs from Harvard and Wharton and wherever we may get them. But how do you train people to lead people, to have both the balance of the brain power, the horsepower, and yet the empathy and compassion for engagement and followership? And honestly, I didn't even know that about myself. And to release me to that reality is that I ran towards that. And those were 2 of my greatest gifts of learn as much as you can, sponsors and mentors along the way, and asking for help, and leading from where you are.
So leading from where you are is such a great tagline, as it relates to knowing that you can have an impact no matter where you are in the business, and that you could create followership even though you were not running a department, or you didn't have 150 people reporting to you, that we can have an impact from a leadership perspective wherever we sit in the business. That idea of mentorship and sponsorship, Cindy, if you were giving advice as to how to seek that type of sponsorship, and specifically, if you could, I'm curious about that feedback for everyone, but specifically, if you could, speaking to the women in the audience around how to think about finding sponsorship and what your responsibility is in that journey in terms of finding a sponsor or finding someone to help you see the whole playing field.
Yeah. First of all, I really appreciate the question and the opportunity to talk about the difference in the roles of your support system can play, and specifically calling out how women do that in March, the International Women's Month. So I have a point of view. I don't claim that it's right, but it's mine. And, as it relates, so there have been plenty of studies. So I'll start from the point of fact. There are so many research studies that Deloitte, McKinsey, and KPMG, and I think I saw one from the Gallup poll as well, is that women tend to be over-mentored and under-sponsored, right? We ask everybody for help and support and advice and that kind of thing. And I have found in my experience that is absolutely true as well. And so there's advisors, the people that are more acute that you go to for a specific expertise. Can you help me on this, right? Very situational, isolated, maybe one-time event. The mentors that you go back to and they talk to you about you. But as it relates to advancement, the golden role is this whole sponsorship, as I described earlier, who leverages themselves and their networks on your behalf. And my personal view on it is that you have to be the best protege to attract sponsors. You can't ask somebody to be a sponsor. And the reason is, my analogy that I use is like paying a bill. If I want you to leverage your network or your social capital or your political capital, it's like asking somebody to write a check for you. You don't go do that. Like, we all have enough savvy that we probably wouldn't go do that. And I think of sponsorship in the very same way. However, being attractive protege, which is the corollary to mentor mentee, sponsor protege, is, being successful at what you do, being someone that others want to see succeed, being kind, being talented, shining. When you go into a room, shining and speaking, the truth. If you're asked for your point of view, giving it. And that was the thing that I think attracted Paul to me. As I described, I was so naive, I didn't know, but every opportunity I got, it was, part of it was about a minute of saying, oh my God, this is so big and so overwhelming. And then the next minute was getting to it. And that was a lesson too of running towards the light, of running to the pain points. And here's one that I think is the absolute key to attracting sponsors: solving problems, not looking for safety. One mentor told me there are three kind of people in business, and you got to decide early which one of these people you want to be. There's the people who run for cover, right? Don't want to be near a problem because they think it's a career-limited move. There are the people who run for office that are always politicking, finding in the right social circles, wanting to always be next to the executives when you have some kind of reception of some sort. And then there are the people who run the business. Be one of those people who run the business. And so I have found that I think sometimes on purpose, sometimes not, always got in the business with the greatest warts, the biggest challenges, and run towards the sun of finding great people to put around that together we can solve big problems. And when you solve big problems for the company, big problems for your boss, your leader, they won't forget you. They just won't. Loyalty is at a premium.
Yeah, that is, I've probably asked that question a number of times in different audiences. That is the most concrete and tangible, real feedback I think I've ever heard. And so thank you for that. I'm gonna pivot a little bit because you talked about this, this continuous learning. And I was struck, I think the first time I met you, and now I'm starting to veer off because this is also interesting to me, Cindy, that like all these questions that I sent you before, like I'm throwing them away now. So now we're in uncharted territory. But you talk about continuous learning and sort of running to the problem. And I was struck by someone with a technology background, with all of these experiences at Medtronic and 3M, these super innovative, like cutting edge kind of healthcare delivery companies in many respects. And you made a hard career choice and said, I'm going to jump into a service industry. And I remember thinking before I met you, okay, I have to find out why that pivot. And your answer was a lot about that continuous learning, but I'm just maybe help everyone see like how you're making these career choices. Because in any one of these spots, you could have stayed and continued to be really successful. You made some choices, and maybe specifically on this Brookdale choice, what drove that thinking?
Yeah, so I think of my career and my life, honestly, as a portfolio. And so one of my fundamental beliefs so I love everything healthcare. So just know that is a driver of my interest in Accolade and the model that you created and the people, both on the management team as well as the board that I've had the privilege of meeting. But I fundamentally believe for healthcare to solve some of the biggest problems that we have in healthcare, it's going to be an aggregation of both products, services, and technology. And that's where real value creation will happen. And so my whole career and life has been spent in various aspects, but all on the product side, right? I've done acute, post-acute, pharmaceuticals, devices, and then supplies, medical supplies, and kind of followed the various continuum of care. And then, that said, I didn't have multi-site services. Now, I ran 18 manufacturing sites across the globe, but it wasn't the same as multi-site services. And here we have 700 communities at Brookdale, and when you've seen one, we solve scale by the ones, and we'll get into that at another time. And so for me, to go back to how I, as an executive, can grab or drive the most value into the industry sector that I've chosen, or that's chosen me. I believe healthcare has chosen me, and I need, or at least need, more exposure to services and digitization. And so there are so many similarities. I'm hoping that that'll be a pivot into one of these questions of my first board at Best Buy that is very similar to the choice that I made to be with Accolade, while on the surface, it doesn't look that obvious of what those similarities are. And so my choice was very intentional about getting more direct service experience. It's not that I read, not that somebody told me, not that I hired somebody who said. It was, I've rolled up my sleeves, gotten dirty with operations, and it's 24/7. Our business does not shut down. We've got 60,000 plus residents. We've got 42,000 associates, 36,000 in my organization. I have never run anything, even on a global basis, with this level of complexity. And so I just believe I have, and I know for sure, the amount of growth, now COVID helped with that, but the amount of personal and professional growth that I have lived through and experienced in this year cannot be compared to anything that I've ever done before. And I think that's probably true for most of us. But to do it in an industry segment like this has just accelerated learning and development in unpredictable ways. So I'm so grateful for this experience.
I can imagine just stepping into a new role like this one right before the pandemic started. So some questions to dig into there. Let me quick to the rest of the group. We're getting to a point here where I'm going to open it up to broader questions. So put your questions in the chat. We'll open it up, and you can raise your hand as well if you'd like to ask your question directly. But just start queuing up your questions, because here in about 4 or 5 minutes we'll flip this over to you. And I'm reading the inspiration in the chat. People are really excited to talk with you. I've got 5 things I want to talk to you about, but I'm going to try to narrow it down. And so I definitely want to get your what drew you to healthcare, and I of course we have to get an Accolade commercial in here somewhere, Cindy. So what drew you to Accolade? Yes. It's got to be true. We have to pay the advertisers, and so we definitely need we need that. And but before we do that, let me ask you a question that's off script as well. You step into a role like this one, and the world really, boom, everything changes. And you're back in Nashville. You've moved away from Minneapolis, where you spent most of your adult life. You're starting fresh in a company where you don't know a bunch of people, and you had to show remarkable resilience through that. There were ups and downs in that journey, but probably right away there were some downs while you're trying to figure out what to do and where to go. If you were to share your secrets for how you kept an even keel and kept plowing through and kept learning and kept growing through that kind of a challenging environment, what makes you resilient? What makes you have the grit to fight through all of these things?
So I'll start with a cliche borrowed from the Kennedy Space Museum of what do you do when failure is not an option, right? When giving up is not an option. We've got 60,000 plus residents depending on us every day. Failure is not an option. But I will tell you personally, it was so unsettling to have a crisis of this magnitude and walking into a company and an environment where I felt like I knew nothing and could contribute very little, because what I came in to do, all of a sudden what was needed from me is not what I thought I was bringing to the organization. And as a leader, it was so unsettling. And so for me, that search for purpose and search for meaning, and I really did believe that I'm here for a reason, and it didn't look like what I thought it was going to be. And so, I just jumped in to where I fit in. What was my gift to the world? One of them, very early on, my product background was perfect for, is securing PPE. I called up the CEO that I was still friends with at 3M and saying, could we earmark us N95s, the real N95s, and not the black market that we had found ourselves, just being bombarded by those requests. Calling friends at Grainger and saying, can we get 3 million surgical masks, and can we get prioritized, and working with the procurement team, because we never had to drive PPE and healthcare products at this scale and volumes before. And so my background really did help facilitate that in the earlier days when hospitals even could not secure some of the PPE. So that was one. The second was in organization. I really am a student of how to organize for value, how to organize. And so I remember calling up a retired 4-star general with the military and saying, our folks, it was 4 months before anybody tapped out to take a break for a weekend. We worked 7 days a week for months on end, and I was so concerned with burnout. So we started internally, we built it from my conversations with this general, who was one of my mentees, actually, and said, General Leon, how do you get in the middle of a battle folks to tap out and mandatory rest? And we used many of those models, and we created an internal program called the Corporate Athlete. How do you run a marathon at a sprint pace and live to tell about it? And I kid you not, I can't tell you the emotional response of the team who said, we've got executives who care about us and not just the work we do, that gives me permission to rest. I am exhausted, but until you gave me permission, nobody wanted to raise their hand and say they needed it. But we start seeing errors and slippage. And when you get errors and slippage in the middle of a pandemic, people die. We couldn't afford that. And so, or quit, which we also couldn't afford. And so it has been a gift. And the only thing that I could say is, no, it didn't look like I thought it was going to be. But man, was it a gift to me personally, so fulfilling and rewarding. But the other part is being comfortable, being uncomfortable, and a willingness to be vulnerable. I say it all the time. I just got here. I don't know. This is what I think. I don't know. And I think, and here's the last thing, if I may, just for a second. Before I came, one of the warning signs that I got is the organization chewed up and spit out, had organ rejection of new executives that were outside of the industry. Most of the folks in our industry have been in this industry for decades. And so coming in, kind of at the tip of the spear, at the top of the organization with no experience, there was no place for that level of bravado. And one, I don't have it. I'm not wired that way. But number two, there's really no place for it. And so that level of vulnerability, coupled with the pandemic, coupled with the will to help and serve, really made it work. And the team received me. And so I found the Rumi saying absolutely true. What you're reaching towards is reaching back towards you.
That is, it's such an inspirational story in so many ways. I mean, I think one of the things I take out of those comments is you can lead, be vulnerable, not know every answer, and even sometimes be a little bit scared. And that it's okay for all of those emotions to be bundled up in, hey, we still got to go forward.
We got to keep moving.
And that I think oftentimes one of the things that I always try to remind people of is, when you're trying to do something no one's ever done before, you're going to find a lot of territory where no one knows what to do. And if you can turn that into the fun stuff, if that can be fun for you as opposed to scary, or maybe a little scary and a little fun at the same time, you got yourself something that might be really interesting. So let's go all the way back. And you said healthcare called you, and you've clearly made it your career choice, and you've now really experienced it from all these different angles. What was it about healthcare specifically that's made you make a career of it?
Yeah, I'll be a short story. I was in utilities before I got into healthcare as an intern in college, and natural gas. And I can remember my first internship at Eli Lilly, and we were in this cornfield, remind you, and we were doing our quality training, and they had this bulk container. I now know it was a centrifuge, but a mini development. We were scaling a product that would ultimately be an antibiotic, specifically for pediatric antibiotic. And they had this powder and let us run our fingers through it. Obviously, we were going to throw it away. So we ran our fingers through it, and they were like, look at this powder. And then they took us out to this huge manufacturing site, and you saw these huge centrifuges drying out the powder. And then they showed us tablets or capsules at the time. And they said, this powder that you're touching and the work that you're doing will save the life of somebody you know or your own one day. Done. The fact that I was doing something to save lives, that I could make money and do well while doing good, right? It spoke to everything. And so here's the last part of this story and a little bit of self-awareness. Much, much later, when I started going through all of these battery of self-assessments and tests, and I became to understand the conflict called syndicate, because I am a walking conflict, that my drive to compete was just as high as my altruism scores. Like, they shouldn't go together. One hand, you should be a priest. The other hand, you should be a lawyer. And so this walking conflict that healthcare answers and allows me to exist in this conflict in a healthy way, I think. Yeah, so there you go.
That's actually, I feel like, and you're seeing this in the chat, Cindy, there's a lot of people at Accolade who feel exactly that way, that I love working hard. I love trying new hard things. The idea of building a company and doing well while doing good is really core to the ethic of the company. Last question for me, and then I'll pop it open. You had no doubt board choices galore after you left the Best Buy board, and you had choices to make in terms of where you could go. And I think I remember you and I were talking when we first got together that you were evaluating a number of options. Can you tell us a little bit about the choice you made? And you alluded to it earlier, but what was it? What about Accolade attracted you?
Yep. So 3 primary reasons, and one is not. First of all, this is a commercial break. This is Accolade Blue. And I was very intentional about wearing my Accolade Blue. Yes, I want to come through the door. It's like come through the door, being on brand. So there you go. But there were 3 primary reasons. One is just I believed in the business model of the company. I believe fundamentally in what you're trying to accomplish, this idea of the advocacy and the navigation along with the analytics, and then the humanism, the fact that you want to maintain the humanity of healthcare and not have it be a pure technology play. Here's why I say that is very reminiscent of my Best Buy experience, because I really love my experience there. So in the spirit, in the days of Amazon and every other consumer electronic company went out of business, there is something magic, though, about the brick and the mortar with the technology to figure out how to be a high tech and a high touch at the same time and do it in an efficient way with these type of outcomes, and to be able to combine the physical health with the mental health that you're doing with the Ginger Partnership, I just believe is game changing. So that's the principle. Do I believe in the mission and in the work and the model of the company? That's my starting point. The second point is, what is the strength of the management team? If you're going to get your choice, like I got enough turnaround in my day job. I want to be part of something that's growing, that I could advocate and help with commercial scale. And do I believe that the management team has the capability? So I, just like you might have listened to my speeches, I went on and I listened to your earnings calls, and I went and researched, and I even talked to folks in Seattle, and what's up with this guy, and what do you know? And it was remarkable. It didn't matter what channel I used, what network I used, some personal, some political, it didn't matter. Every channel came up positive for Raj and his management team, bar none. And then lastly was the board. Are these people that I can do 2 things: learn from and have a good time with? Because we're gonna spend a lot of time together. You got a choice. Are these folks that, at the end of or in a board dinner when we're back together, or when we're wrestling through a big decision, are you going to trust their judgment? They're going to respect yours. And at the end of the day, you're going to enjoy that time well spent when, time is at a premium, because we don't have a whole lot of it. So those are my 3 reasons that I said yes to Accolade's opportunity.
Thank you for sharing that. Thank you for sharing that.